My pick for the #1 best chess game of the 1940s is Molinari versus Roux Cabral from the Uruguayan Championship of 1943. Now, with all of my previous #1 picks from prior decades, I really felt that it was likely that most of you would be familiar with the games. They're famous games and famous players. However, with this game, although it has a certain fame, it is known as the Uruguayan Immortal, and it's certainly been covered by some other YouTubers. I suspect that more than half of you might be seeing this game for the first time. If so, I promise you will be dazzled by the brilliant finish to this game. The opening phase of this game is classic. Both players are going to play in very natural and theoretical ways. We are going to get into a Moran semi-Slav variation, one of my favorite opening variations. Now, after bishop d3, black goes ahead and takes on c4. Basically, black has been waiting for this bishop to develop so that it's possible to capture on c4 and force the bishop to take a second turn to recapture. Now you push forward with b5, pushing this bishop back and getting ready for this bishop to be very strong on this long diagonal in these Moran semi-Slav positions. Bishop d3, pawn to a6, because you can't push forward with c5, which you really want to do until this pawn is protected in some way. So now white castles, which is not really to the point. Black is going to be able to achieve c5, and white needs play to respond. A good way to respond is pawn to e4 in this position. Castles already allows black to break with c5 without white achieving any play. As a result, black already gets a great game. However, the game didn't need to be as great as it turned out to be, because white certainly should not have played pawn to b3 in this position. This is just much too slow and indirect a way to develop, and black is doing great. We're going to see some inaccurate play from here on by both players, but in general, black is the one pushing, and white is often the one playing a little bit too indirectly, not really sensing the point in the position. Now, bishop to b7, beautiful diagonal. One of my favorite things about the Moran semi-Slav is this diagonal right here, and this game is going to be a perfect illustration of why this diagonal can be so killer. Queen to e2, queen to b6, rook d1, bishop e7, pawn to a4, and now, because of the pressure on b5, black pushes forward with b4. Now, this isn't a bad move, but black should follow up forcefully, and black fails to do so. One of the major mistakes that black does make in the game. After knight b1, the knight clearly intends to come around to the c4 square, a square that has been relinquished by the advance of the b pawn. Now, to respond, black should play actively, and the best way to do that is to take on d4, and after knight takes d4, play knight e5. You have the idea of picking up this light squared bishop, which would be a problem because this powerhouse would then be unopposed, and you're also in a good position to just castle and put rooks here and here, and in general, white is struggling because these pieces clustered on the queen side are not really finding good squares for development, and it makes it hard for black to get for white to get all the pieces into the game. But after knight b1, black plays rook c8, which isn't really to the point and gives white time for this maneuver. Knight to d2, now black captures on d4, a move too late. Knight c4, an intermediate move hitting the queen before recapturing on d4. Knight takes d4. It's also possible to try and play this with an isolated pawn structure, but we get knight takes d4 in the game. Black castles, now bishop to d2, and pawn to a5. I think really this is maybe the second notable mistake from black in this game. And both mistakes are kind of similar. Both push pawns forward on the queen side and surrender very, very nice squares to the white knights. Now, the b5 square is available to the knight on d4. Black is really displaying a certain disdain for squares for knights, and black isn't going to be punished for it, but it's definitely a concession that black doesn't need to make. Now, knight b5, the queen falls back to a8. It's certainly beautiful to have the queen and bishop lined up here, creating a powerful battery hitting g2. Now, in this position, white makes a mistake. One of the most common mistakes that players make in a chess game. It's the mistake of wanting to win. Now, in this position, white should just accept that black has a threat to g2, play pawn to f3, and there's a plentiful game ahead. Lots can happen from this point forward. This bishop is a little blunted, and you know both players have their assets in this position. Again, lots can happen. Great game to look forward to. But in this position, white plays knight to d6, trying for too much, saying, hey, I'm hitting your rook. You better move that rook, and then I'm going to take your bishop over here, and I'm going to eliminate that critical, powerful light squared bishop, and I'll be doing great. I'll be much better in the resulting position. Of course, black isn't going to move the rook. This is the easiest exchange sacrifice that you will ever see. We see bishop takes g2 here, already picking up one pawn for the exchange after knight takes c8, rook takes c8, and just wrecking the light squares around white's king. If you have a problem offering this particular exchange sacrifice, then I really advise looking over some good examples of exchange sacrifices and weak color complexes. This is an exchange sacrifice that any player should just be dying to make. The chess engine, and of course this is 1943, the players don't have chess engine, is screaming that black is already winning like +2, +3. And of course, that should just be correct. You cannot give up all of the light squares around your king and survive. Now, the only way to try to hold the game in terms of controlling the light squares is to push e4, but you don't have the firepower to do it right away, which is why rook e1. This move also avoids a skewer here that could pick up the exchange, although I'd be really reluctant to give up my beautiful bishop for that rook on d1. But bishop f3 anyway, pushing the queen back to f1, only move. Queen d5 with a massive threat of queen to g5 right here. Very obvious threat, but that doesn't mean it's not very, very strong. So e4, a clever response. We are defending g5 by opening up the diagonal for the bishop on d2, and we are hitting the queen here on d5. This is the first of many excellent moments to pause your video and try to figure out how black responded in this position. Well, we should probably point out here that you do not need to play spectacularly to win the game. For example, queen to h5 is an excellent move. Black has excellent compensation, really more than that, and black should win in relatively short order. But from this point forward, you should assume that the spectacular continuation is the continuation we are looking for every time I ask you to pause the video, and it is probably also the continuation that Roux Cabral plays. So in this position, he plays rook takes c4, a beautiful exchange and queen sacrifice. Now, the exchange sacrifice can be accepted, but the queen sacrifice cannot be, because if the queen sacrifice is accepted, there is rook to g4 check. You can only play queen g2, and you're like, oh, I lost the queen. That stinks. But then you're like, oh, actually I'm getting mated because it's either rook takes h2 with rook h1, or if I go to h1 instead, then it's just rook g3 mate on the spot. So, I can't do that, right? So after rook takes c4, it is the exchange sacrifice that's accepted with pawn takes c4. And one question here is, why did black sacrifice the exchange? I think the answer is actually relatively simple. The rook on c8 isn't really able to include itself in the attack. There's this one beautiful line where it's a hero where it reaches g4, but for the most part, the rook can't really access the king side very well. Meanwhile, the knight is actually a pretty good defender. In a lot of lines, it will go to e3, and it can help defend the very, very sensitive g2 point. So trading the uninvolved rook for the very important knight makes total sense. So after pawn takes c4, we see queen h5 with some very, very big and relatively obvious threats that must be stopped. Bishop f4 trying to hold the g file now. And now knight to g4, black's minor pieces, which is really all that black has left besides the queen, are jumping into the attack. All four will be involved and active. So bishop e2 trying to exchange off this very, very powerful bishop, and the other knight jumps in. Now, an interesting question here is what happens if white does capture here on f3? Well, if bishop takes f3, the only completely crushing and decisive continuation is actually knight takes king g2 and then g5, which is not so obvious. Now, it's pretty clear that you can't take this knight because after king takes, then you have knight takes h2 with a royal fork and a discovered check, and you're winning the queen here with a continuing attack. And also the bishop is hanging as well, so that's not helping out either. But after g5, what happens if bishop back to g3? Well, the key idea is that the G pawn's advance here is not just intending to kick the bishop for one turn, it's also intending, after knight takes h2, to advance the pawn to g4. And this threatens queen takes h2 mate, and it also threatens queen h3 mate, for example, after queen h1. This position is decisive for black. Very, very beautiful position right here, where white has the move and can really not defend in this position. I love g5, g4. So in the game, after knight d to e5, we see pawn to h3, trying to get rid of this knight right here, but of course the knight's not going anywhere because you can't take because of queen and mate. Now, the other minor piece gets involved, bishop c5, targeting the f2 square. One point here is that if ever bishop takes e5, then black can take back with queen takes e5 and threaten queen to h2 mate, and also queen to g3 because the f pawn is pinned. So that's a huge problem in addition to all of the other huge problems. So now bishop to g3, trying to hold on to the f2 pawn. This is another great moment to pause your video and try to figure out Roux Cabral's continuation. Well, he plays knight takes f2. He's just getting started sacrificing his minor pieces. He's already sacrificed both of his rooks, and it's time to start sacrificing minor pieces, and he's going to sacrifice most of them by the end of the game. Now, after knight takes f2, the basic point here is to open up the g-file. You're first getting rid of your own knight that was in the queen's way on the g-file, and then when the bishop captures, you've also cleared it out. So you got rid of two minor pieces that were clogging up the g-file, so that now queen g5 check is possible. King h2 in this position, and now queen to f4 check. Now, if king back to g1, saying please take a draw by perpetual check, of course you don't need to take a draw by perpetual check because you have queen g3 check, this bishop is pinned, so queen g2 and queen takes g2 mate. So after queen f4 check, it's bishop g3, and this is the final moment to pause your video and try to figure out how Roux Cabral played. In fact, black can pick between two different moves that lead to checkmate in 4. They are essentially different move orders with the same basic idea. In the game, black plays bishop to g1 check, which is absolutely my favorite move order because this beautiful bishop sacrifice seems to come from the absolute blue. It's so shocking and so surprising. Now, white can capture with either member of the royal family. King takes g1 is the more easily refuted move because now the king has been decoyed away from the defense of the bishop. You take on g3, queen g2, and queen takes g2, check, mate. Now, the alternative is to capture with the queen. Queen takes g1, and in this case, it's not so obvious what black is up to. However, the next move clarifies everything. Knight to g4, check, giving up yet another minor piece. Now, you could also have started with knight g4 check and then played bishop g1. It's really a matter of preference. The point after knight to g4 check is to open the h-file, and after h takes g4, queen h6 check, you no longer have the queen on the f1 square, so you can no longer block with queen to h3. As a result, your only legal move is bishop h4, and queen takes h4 is checkmate. In the game, white actually resigned after knight g4 check, seeing the coming mate. Fair enough. What a beautiful final position, and what a beautiful game. If you want to see more of my top 10 chess games of the 1940s, simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.